Стой, я помогу.
Пойдемте, я вас провожу. В этом году 100 лет. Я хотел вам рассказать. Если минут, я вам расскажу. Я несколько слов расскажу о нашем университете, чтобы, так сказать, ввести в курс наших дел. Ну вот вы уже спросили, что когда образовался наш университет. Образовался указом еще царской России 21 ноября 1910 года. Поэтому 21 ноября 2010 года ему исполняется 100 лет. И праздновать мы будем 26 ноября, будет у нас торжественный концерт. А вся неделя с 22 ноября по 26 ноября это юбилейная неделя. Вот. Так основные празднуют 25-26 ноября. Потом стал педагогическим институтом, потом стал университетом классического типа, ну и сейчас таковым и является. И самое интересное то, что правительство губернии Витебской и витебская общественность, царское правительство дало отказ и аргументировало это следующим, что университет есть в Киеве, и одновременно просили Аршанский лицей открыть тоже. А лицей есть в Одессе. И это был один образовательный округ. Киев, Одесса, Вильна, Минск и так далее. Один образовательный округ. Но все-таки 15 лет боролись, просили. Наконец были выделены средства. И в 1910 году, как компромиссное решение, был открыт учительский институт. Вот, который сегодня мы, в общем-то, и имеем. За эти годы более 50 тысяч студентов было выпущено. И сегодня наш университет имеет 11 факультетов. Но традиционно еще с 1910 года в университете существуют такие факультеты, как математика, то есть математический факультет, ну, он назывался физико-математический раньше, сейчас их два. Математический отдельно, физический отдельно, биологический факультет, филологический факультет, белорусской филологии факультет, социальной педагогики и психологии, художественно-графический факультет, физической культуры и спорта, педагогический факультет. Ну, в общем-то, это, естественно, те, которые находятся сейчас на разных курсах, и это у них как дисциплина, либо те, которые учатся на филологическом факультете, на специальности романо-германская филология, английский язык. У нас есть такая специальность. Романо-германская филология, английский язык. И есть вторая романо-германская филология, немецкий язык. Поэтому это специализированные факультеты, которые непосредственно готовят специалистов английского языка. Значит, у нас есть кафедры иностранного языка, она общая университетская кафедра, которая...
Очень важно, что я рада слышать, что у вас есть такой сильный факультет по этому поводу. И тоже рада, конечно, узнать, что число студентов, которые изучают английский язык, растут. Тоже хорошо. Я думаю, что это то, что я хотела бы сказать.
Хорошо. Тогда будем смотреть, будем показывать.
Хорошо.
Да, на буклет. Тут есть наш буклет и есть книга, посвященная Марку Шагалу, Витебск, Шагал и Витебск. Вот. Ну, а это наш художественно-графический факультет делает такие, пусть будут у вас или в посольстве, как воспоминания о пребывании в нашем университете. Тем более здесь написано вот 100 лет, вот 100 лет, это художественно-графический факультет и его кафедры. Кафедры этого факультета, которые, в общем-то, вот изображены здесь. Я думаю, что в любой момент...
Да. Уже тема искусства. Это особенное окно.
Стекло, наверное. Спасибо. Все, тогда мы вас одеваем.
Хорошо.
Так, и идем на художественно-графическое факультет. А это можно оставить.
Разные запоминающиеся, узнаваемые по композиции. Пейзажи, вот опять же, Михаила Васильевича Левковича, пейзажи тоже есть. То есть самая разнообразная палитра. И пейзажи, и натюрморты, и тематические полотна. Все у нас как бы представлено. Мастера у нас действительно на все руки, что называется.
Натуральный цвет, если не раскрашивается, чисто натуральный цвет. Ну, здесь развитие народного творчества.
Исполнительного комитета Константин Владимирович Черный.
Добрый день, уважаемые. Я вообще не буду занимать ваше время. Добро пожаловать посол Ее Величества Королевы Великобритании Республики Беларусь, госпожа Розмари Томас.
Добрый день. Это большое удовольствие для меня иметь возможность посетить вашу университету. Первый вопрос, я думаю, будет в каком языке мы сделаем презентацию. Я думаю, что здесь много людей говорят прекрасно английский язык. I'm going to talk in general about the European Union, but I'm also going to touch on a programme within the European Union which is called the Eastern Partnership. The Eastern Partnership is important because it's probably the most important road or instrument in which the European Union engages countries such as Belarus, the neighbours of the European Union, who are obviously important for us because you live exactly on our border, and important for us because we share the same history and the same culture. Okay. So the European Union hasn't always been called the European Union, but it has existed in one form or another since 1945. I think we all know 1945 is an incredibly important date, especially for you here in Belarus, the end of one of the worst wars in our history on Europe. Very interesting question then. How do you prevent war? One means is to limit the means of carrying out war, that is the industrial production that produces weapons, and have transparency about this. So a number of European countries decided to set up an organisation that was called the European Coal and Steel Community. This allowed them to have a great deal of detail and transparency about production of coal and of steel amongst their neighbours, and in this way to build up confidence. So the 6 founders of this organisation were Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. That organisation was very successful, and so it was decided that you could develop the political potential much further, because at its heart this organisation was set up essentially for political reasons rather than economic reasons. But once it was set up, it began to become useful not only for political reasons, but for economic development also. And as we know, economic development is also a very important way to preserve peace. So in 1957, we see this organisation become the European Economic Community, and the legal basis for this was the Treaty of Rome, which was signed in 1957 by those same 6 founding countries. As I said, it was a successful organisation, and successful was it that eventually other European countries wanted to join it. And so you see from 1970 to 1979, you saw a new group of countries come on board, with Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, my own country, joining in 1973. And the original 6 founders then became 9. It was, as I've said before, there's a big political aspect to the European Union. And that has required that we keep maximum solidarity between partners. It's important politically, and it's also important economically. So you see at this time, the larger, richer states beginning to transfer quite significantly to smaller, less developed states. Important politically because it gives stability, but also important economically because the stronger the market that you create with wealthier consumers, the stronger your market becomes. And so it makes not only political sense, but economic sense to build up the strength of your neighbours. Because the stronger your neighbour, the stronger you are. So it has to be a mutual cooperative relationship. We also see at this time the foundation of the European Parliament, which was to bring a parliamentary angle into the European economic community. I have to say the Parliament remained pretty much a quite weak organisation until maybe the last decade, and it's become an increasingly powerful organisation, and one we all need to bear that in mind these days, because it's not just enough to convince the European Union that a policy is a good idea. You have to convince the members of the European Parliament as well to support policy. That makes life more difficult, but that is the way in a democracy. So we must just live with it. Moving on then, of course, another extremely important date, we mentioned 1945. It wasn't long after that time that what we knew as the Cold War set in. From 1989, for the next few years, that Cold War came to an end. And this opened up a new chapter in history for Europe, not just for the European Union, of course, but for Europe as well. Because it's at this time that those political divisions between Eastern Europe and Western Europe began to heal. And that started a process of the European Union assimilating another large group of countries. Around 10 countries joined at that time, including some of your own direct neighbours, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and that was your... So this is the very biggest wave of new membership in the European Union. And while it's been very welcome and I think very successful, it's been quite difficult also. So it's not been an easy path either for those already in the European Union or those who were seeking to join. But in the end, I think it's been successful and it's certainly contributed to peace and stability on our continent. In 2007, we see 2 more states joining, at that time Romania and Bulgaria, bringing the number of countries to a massive 27. So having started with a small group of just 6, you're then trying to coordinate political policy and economic policy between 27 states. It's no easy business, and it can be very frustrating at times. But again, it's brought greater democracy to the continent and certainly has made Europe a more stable place. Just to note here that we have a common currency in the European Union, but there are 2 countries who've decided they're not joining this at the moment. That is Sweden and my own country, the United Kingdom. And there's also a number of countries who want to join the euro. I think Estonia is virtually ready, in fact. But there's other countries who would like to join but haven't quite got their economy in the right shape yet. And evidently the global economic crisis that you're living through and we're living through has obviously affected that. I mentioned before about the transfer of budgetary resources from richer states to poorer states. This has been very successful. So those countries that historically were quite poor, such as Ireland, have become relatively wealthy states, and that has allowed Ireland to really develop its infrastructure and to reverse the problem they had with emigration from Ireland. So you've had a lot of people abroad, now they've home, now made the economy somewhere stronger. Yes, so just for purposes, you look at 2001, the GDP of Ireland was 1.690. You see it growing fairly strongly to 2008, when it was 185,721, making Ireland one of the wealthiest countries in the European Union per capita. I think you're probably aware that Ireland's had quite a bad crisis, shall we say, a bad global economic crisis, just like my own country. So they've got some very significant problems that they need to sort out now, but I'm sure that they will overcome these issues. But this is just by way of illustrating the effect of being in the European Union. And perhaps if we take a country closer to home for you, perhaps Lithuania, there at that bottom line. Its GDP in 2001, 13,577, rising to 32,292 in 2008. So you can see in general a very positive effect as the countries share resources between them and make trading relations just as easy as possible as wealth increases. And these are just the per capita figures. I don't think we'll spend too long on that. That simply shows the figures per person. Let's pick Bulgaria and let's combine. People, per person GDP in 2001, 5,800 euros, more or less doubling in by 2008. I mentioned I'd say a few words about the Eastern Partnership. The Eastern Partnership is an initiative of Poland and Sweden within the European Union, but it's been strongly supported by other European Union partners. It's a recognition we have some important neighbours on our border who equally are part of Europe. And you see these 6 countries here, this group of 6 countries: Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia. These countries are either aren't in the European Union. Some of them have a wish to join. Other countries, I think including Belarus, have no desire to join the European Union, but wants to develop a relationship with the European Union. And this is our main tool for developing that relationship. So the goal of the relationship, in a nutshell, as we would say, is to bring partners closer to the EU so that we can increase cooperation between the EU and these partners. And in this way to promote stability, good governance and economic development. For any partnership to work well, it has to be on the basis of certain shared values and certain shared understanding. So this is a key part of the Eastern Partnership. These values, nothing strange about them. Democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights and basic freedoms, and the desire eventually to develop a market economy and sustainable development. There's 2 main components Within the programme, there is a direct bilateral strand and there is a multilateral strand. And here you see 5 of those states at the moment moving on the bilateral track, and Belarus at the moment has not moved to that stage of the partnership. But I think in time it should be possible, should Belarus want to do that, to move to the bilateral strand. But at the moment we have a number of good programmes going with Belarus on the multilateral strand. I'll just move quickly through the bilateral strand, since it's not directly relevant to Belarus right now. It's the possibility for creating a new basis for relations between the European Union and these states, including an association agreement. Association agreements open up quite a wide path for developing economic and political relations, so that they're quite deep agreements. And that can lead, for those that want to, for gradual integration into the EU economy, including the possibility of developing deep and comprehensive free trade areas. This is quite a big goal for Ukraine, for example, and quite intensive talks are going on about how best to try and establish this deep and comprehensive free trade agreement and area. It's not simple. And it will take quite some time and a lot of commitment from both Ukraine and the European Union. But negotiations are ongoing, and we must watch developments there quite closely. It would also lead to easier travel to the EU, with the long-term goal of full visa liberalisation. Another quite important aspect, I think, Belarus is a major transit country, understands very well the importance of energy security. It's a big question for all of us on the European continent. The Eastern Partnership allows a very useful framework for dialogue on this issue, so that we can all come up with some creative thinking. There's also a goal to have interconnected energy markets, and I think Belarus has been having some interesting discussions with its neighbours, including in Lithuania, about trying to create a common energy market. So about civil servants and diplomats, to some extent the most important part of diplomacy is just people to people, students, teachers, business people, cultural personalities. In some ways this is the most useful type of relations that can exist between countries, and that is why we have a people-to-people track within the European Union under the Eastern Partnership. It's intended to have summits every 2 years. The first one was in 2009. The next summit will be in Hungary in May next year. But at the first summit, the European Union and the Eastern Partnership states signed their founding document, which is called the Prague Declaration. And here you can see the various institutional parts of the Eastern Partnership. So foreign ministers meet once a year. There's also a parliamentary assembly aspect. I spoke before about the fact that there is now a European Parliament. Parliamentary dimension to regional politics and economic development is important. Not always easy, but it is important. It means that once you have managed to negotiate agreement, it's much more likely to stick and to work if you have parliamentary agreement, rather than ministers just telling people how it's going to be. So that's meant to get buy-in from the population. And there's also a local and regional authorities assembly. Another important institution within the Eastern Partnership is the Civil Society Forum. Within the European Union, we place great emphasis on the role of civil societies. The idea, I think, is it's not, governments don't have to do everything. I talked about the most important part of diplomacy often being between people like you and your counterparts, between teachers, between students, between businessmen. Governments don't have to do everything. They can leave it to their people to get on and build relationships, and in this way, maybe to build the strongest possible relationships, because they involve normal people like you and me, and not just ministers. This just gives some idea of the kind of funds that are involved in the Eastern Partnership right now. The Eastern Partnership is not a major fundraising programme, and so it's not meant to be a big spending programme. It's meant to be a way of opening up talks. I like to say it's the first word and not the last word. You'll see quite a big disbalance in financial means spread between the countries. This doesn't just really relate to the size of the population, it relates to how much that country has wanted to cooperate with the European Union, how far into the programme they are. It doesn't necessarily reflect the importance of the country, it shows actually where they are in their negotiations with the EU, where they are in their relations with the EU. Obviously with Belarus, negotiations with the EU, relations with the EU have been their most active since 2008, whereas with Ukraine and with other countries, that dialogue started at a much earlier point. Funds are going to increase by 75% by 2013. I won't spend any more on that. So there's a number of challenges ahead for all of those in the Eastern Partnership. It's how do we consolidate statehood, democracy and good governance. It's not an easy thing to do. Countries such as my own that think we have a very long history of governance and parliamentary democracy. We're constantly making mistakes. We're constantly having to reevaluate why we went wrong and how we should change things. I don't know if it was in the news, but we've just had a major review of government spending. So you can pride yourself on your good governance, but it doesn't stop you from making mistakes. It doesn't stop you from having to learn from your partners. Another challenge would be to address the risks of conflict and instability. Again, not such a big question for you here in Belarus, but if you're Moldova and Ukraine and you're having to deal with the issue of Transnistria, it's how do you deal with that? Of course, the Balkans would be another big area of importance for the European Union. A pretty horrible war was fought there during the 1990s, and they're still suffering the consequences. So how to help the Balkan countries that were involved best build stable societies again. And then how to further advance economic integration and regulatory approximation within the EU. Until we have common standards and a common way of talking to each other, we can't make the most of our ability to develop economic relations. That completes my presentation on the Eastern Partnership. It is our hope that 2011 should be a year for moving things forward within our partnership. We understand that for Belarus, the most important relationship, of course, is its relationship with Russia, and that we don't see why that should prevent us having very good relations between the EU and Belarus too. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'd be very happy to try to answer.
a second-year student. What impression did you get when you first came to our country? And is it any different now after you have stayed here for a while?
The first impression I had was how well it fitted in with what people had told me, what colleagues had told me to expect when I came to Belarus, that I would find the people very friendly, very hardworking, with a strong sense of their European history. And that also I'd find them in some ways showing quite a lot of British characteristics, a sort of pretty calm approach to life, tolerant society, hardworking and organised. So I have to say that bit pretty much matched with my expectations. I think what did surprise me, because obviously I live on an island, and when you live on an island, you know exactly where your boundaries are. It's very clear. But I'm sometimes astonished, you know, when I go and visit places like Grodno, I'm astonished by how resilient people must have to be in this country when history plays a lot of nasty tricks on you and moves your boundaries around and gives you a lot of tough situations to deal with. So I think maybe that's something that made one of the strongest impressions on me. Yeah. Please.
Елена Сиденко, a third-year student. We are to study British literature for 5 years, and my question is, are there any works of Belarusian writers studied in British universities?
I'd have to say I would be very surprised. I'm sorry if that's unwelcome news, but I would be quite surprised. For those that are interested in Slavic languages, with Russian literature to compete with, it would be quite tough, I think. Sorry? Yeah. I mean, another very interesting thing I find about Belarus is you're in an interesting position in terms of languages, shall we say, in that you have a beautiful native language, Belarusian, and I love Russian also. But it seems to me that part of the challenge of being a young state, but with actually a very old language, and the various things that have happened in this part of the world has maybe perhaps held back the development of Belarusian literature. Having been here, I see that you have a number of authors that are well known within this sphere, but it seems to me that there's probably quite a lot to do to get these authors internationally known, and hopefully to have some new authors coming through. I was lucky enough to be given a book of poetry by a young Belarusian poetess. And I've been slowly trying to work my way through these poems. But it did strike me that one of the most important ways to develop and preserve your language is to acquire a substantial amount of literature, which then defines that language and defines the experience of that country. So I think you're in a fascinating but challenging position with Belarusian language. Quite an interesting question for us, because I wonder how many people here know how many different languages we speak in native languages in Great Britain. Can anyone guess? Native languages only. No? Around about 6. Yeah. So in Scotland, 2 languages. In Northern Ireland, their own version of Gaelic. Welsh, of course, which is a very unique language. Very, very small group of people who speak a special language in Cornwall. And that language is very close to the language that is spoken in Brittany in France. Brittany being the Little Britain, which defines Great Britain. So we're not Great Britain in that we think we're great. We're great in the terms that small Britain is in France and Big Britain is the island that we live on. And French is another native tongue for Great Britain because we have the Isle of Jersey. So I raise this now because to actually protect these languages has been a bit of a nightmare. In the 1950s and the 1960s, Welsh, which is a beautiful and unique language, was almost driven to the point of destruction. Not through bad intentions, but through poorly conceived good intentions and quite a large bit of stupidity. So we nearly lost this language, which is a very unique language. But somehow we managed to turn this around, actually with the help of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, that had very forward-leaning views on language protection and language promotion. And with the help of the Council of Europe, we've managed to do a lot to save these languages. And I would say that Welsh now is in a very strong position, which is very good news for me, as my family name is a Welsh name, Thomas.
A third-year student. What, from your point of view, could the British learn from the Belarusians, and vice versa, the Belarusians from the British?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I admire the most is probably the amount of solidarity you show in your society. So I think you've done very well to try to ensure that there hasn't been too big a gap allowed to open up between the wealthiest people in your society and the poorest people in your society. So I think the solidarity aspect is something that I envy. We try to do a lot to address this issue in my country, United Kingdom, but so far we've not been successful in addressing it. So I think this is the area where we could look to learn something from Belarus. In terms of what I think Belarus might learn from Great Britain, perhaps it's a bit arrogant of me to suggest what Belarus could learn from Great Britain. But I think maybe something that might surprise you if you were to live in Great Britain might be the amounts of civic participation in government. So we definitely don't believe that our society has to be regulated purely by the government. We believe that there's quite a big role for ordinary people, and not just in terms of charities, but in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of almost anything you could think of. You would find a civil society element in Britain, and civil organisations were allowed to engage pretty freely without too much government control. So maybe this is something that might surprise you if you lived in Great Britain. Please.
Anastasia, a third-year student. And my question is, what's the difference between British and Belarusian lifestyle from your point of view?
I'm not sure there is that much of a difference. I tend to think that young people tend to be interested in the same things. I hope, you're probably interested in the same things I was interested in when I was your age, which is music, going out, meeting with friends, having opportunities to meet our family, having career opportunities. I think essentially we tend to have the same interests.
So I'm one of the teachers of this university, and because we started to speak about young people, I just wanted to ask you the question whether young people in Great Britain have any problems. And in case of a positive answer, what does the government do just to solve these problems? And what are the main important problems? Thank you.
like to make Britain out to be a paradise, because it's far from a paradise, but I think the thing that is mostly on the mind of young people, especially now, because we are suffering, we really are suffering in the UK, the results of the economic crisis, is career. How am I going to get the best career? How am I going to compete with other people to get the job that I want? We're about to embark on a round of very severe spending cuts in the UK. This is probably going to require students to pay an even bigger sum of money for their education. So these are going to be the key things on students' minds, on the minds of young people at the moment. In terms of how the government is going to deal with that, I think one thing that the government is insistent upon is that those people from poor families should not be affected. So if you're a talented student but you don't have the money, it would be outrageous if there weren't the funds available to ensure that you can have a university education. So the government will look to defend that at all costs. At the moment, we have around about 50% of our young people going to university, so it's quite high. About 20 years ago, it was probably only 25%. So you've had a sort of a huge influx of people needing university education, and of course that's great. But how do you find enough funds to ensure that the education they're getting is a quality education? Part of the solution to that has been charging people in English universities round about 3 flats. I think the level of financial understanding among students is quite high, and they're able to look at the equation of the kind of wages they can earn without a degree, and those wages they can earn with a degree, and they're able to see that it's worth it to go to education. What the government has done up to now is until they've actually secured a job and started to earn over a certain amount a year. So, of course, it's not, you have a system here, I think, that's essentially free. It's essentially free. So we don't have your system, but we do have a means for coping with this. And as I say, the difference actually work during their college life. We don't want our students to do that. That's why we give them these quite expensive loans. But yeah, so this would be the key thing. This is the key thing for young people. I think their other problems tend to be those kind of problems that students normally have, which is finding enough money for socialising.
I'm a senior lecturer, university teacher here, and my question is related to the previous one. So, judging by the media, by what we read and see in mass media, your news channel, for instance, European teachers feel concerned about looming illiteracy among young people. How can it be accounted for, and what measures, steps might be taken in order to improve the situation?
Yeah.
Are literate people in danger of becoming extinct?
I suspect the problem's rather exaggerated in the young Russian press, but nonetheless, it is an issue. We want all of our young people to be able to do basic mathematics and to be able to read. It's incredibly important. There has been an issue that has arisen, I think, over the last 2 decades. If you ask me to specify exactly why, I think some of it might have arisen from the fact that quite a large number of children, not a large number, a certain percentage of children that come into the UK weren't born there, and therefore they're having to pick something up in a foreign language. As to how we've tried to deal with that, the government has a programme where it can, once it's identified that a student is struggling, to actually to carry out one-on-one education with that child to try to bring them up to the required standard.
Please. Hello, my my name is Maria. I'm a second-year student, and Her Excellence, we all know that you have got a very intensive schedule, but how do you spend your spare time? Maybe what are your favorite places in Minsk, for example?
I do have some spare time, and I do like to walk around Minsk. There's some very nice parks, as you know. I'm lucky enough to have my husband here with me for the first time on a diplomatic posting, so that's been great. There's some great places to visit in Minsk, the opera, the Philharmonic. There's also, on a more practical level, some great places to eat. And also I have two cats, two British blue cats that I also play with at the weekends.
May I? Yes. So, Liana Burbuleva, head of the English language department. What do you think of the level of teaching English in Belarus? Thank you.
Well, I was just thinking now what a great accent you've all got here in Vitebsk. It's really I'm really impressed. Your English is very clear, very concise, very good accent. So I would say here it sounds just great. I find it a bit more patchy in Minsk. Your accent sounds very precise. I think you must do quite a lot of work on phonetics. So I think sometimes it can depend on the strength of the phonetics teachers. So whoever it is that deals with phonetics here, who is that? Phonetics? Is it you?
No, grammar.
Grammar. And who's phonetics? Phonetics deserves a big pat on the back. But yes, I mean, I understand English is fast developing as a language that's spoken here in Belarus. I think it can only help to open up a large amount of possibilities. In Britain, we tend to believe that a foreign language on its own is maybe not enough. You need to match it up with maybe a management degree or an accountancy degree in order to make yourself even more marketable. But yes, there's some fantastic levels of English around, and as I understand it, plans to increase even further the teaching time in English at schools. So I'm very envious on this score because, again, in Great Britain, I'm not sure we have the greatest story to tell in terms of the number of us who can really master a foreign language. Please.
A second-year student, do you think the Russian and Belarusian languages are popular in the United Kingdom? Do many people choose to study them? Thank you.
Well, speaking as someone that did a Russian degree 25 years ago, at that time I was studying the very biggest department in Britain where you could learn Russian language. There were only at that time 25 people in each year, which I think goes to show the scale of the problem. And I would say since that time, that's probably reduced even further, I'm afraid. And I would imagine the number of people who speak Belarusian in Britain that aren't actually of Belarusian stock would be really, really very tiny. Sorry about that, but that's the truth.
My name is Eugene. I'm doing my postgraduate course right now and teaching English at the university at the same time. And some time ago, it was possible to find information on the official website of the United Kingdom in Belarus about the system of scientific grants for young scientists, foreign scientists. And could you tell more about the system of grants, probably what scientific areas of research are most interesting for your country and how does it function?
I'm terribly sorry, I don't have that information to my fingertips. If you want to write to us via our website, we'll try and point you in the right direction. But yeah, I'm not too well up on sciences, I'm afraid. I'm an art student. Yes, please.
Raisa Kapilets, a third-year student.
Do the English who study Russian have any opportunities to take an updating course in Russia or Belarus?
That certainly was the case when I was studying Russian. I think there were 4 centres that we used to go to, which would have been Voronezh, Moscow, St. Petersburg, but the 4th centre was Minsk. And I keep meaning to check if that's still the case, because I know it was a popular place to go at the time. So in fact, you've reminded me. I've been wanting to check up on that. Yeah. Okay, I think we're rather running out of time now. So if I could thank you for your patience, and thank you very much for your questions. And just to repeat again, I mean, your English accent is just great. I'm so impressed. So well done and keep it up.
Thank you very much.
Сейчас зал редкой книги и найдет книгу.
Бомбон, с удовольствием. И все эти песни я сам немецкий.